this week on the Discovering God podcast.
A lot of times we've tried to use those, I'm thinking about this now, that tactics basically of fear. We do that with the, hey, accept Jesus into your heart, that all that passage we've talked about, so that you'll go to heaven when you die.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to go to hell, do you?
I know when we get to heaven, there will be people there that said that prayer. And I suspect there will be a lot of people there that never said a prayer that resembles anything like what we call, are you saved? I also think there will be people that are not there that may have said that prayer and lived totally contrary. Thanks for tuning into another episode of the Discovering God podcast, where we hope you come face to face with God by coming face to face with the Word of God. I'm Jeff McLean.
I'm Rip Wahlberg.
And this episode, we're talking about salvation, or what does it mean to be saved?
Yep.
Rip, growing up, I'm sure, like me, this was a common question. Well, was that person saved? Were they saved? Did they experience salvation? How about you?
Yeah, the term was extremely common, and the varying discussions around it were what changed a little bit, but it sort of boiled down to a handful of common themes all the time. But the word saved, how do I get saved? How do I know I'm saved? That word appeared in every question. How do I get my friends saved? Pray that your friends get saved. And all that. Witness to your friends so they get saved. That whole thing has always been in the discussion. Yeah.
Saved from what?
Exactly. So
that's what we'll be looking at.
That's what we're going to look at. Actually, and really the thing of how are we saved?
Right.
Like, so when we talked about it, and tell me if this was the same for you or similar. When we talked about it, it was, you're saved, and oh, by the way, tell me the date you were saved. Like, I remember, and I can still kind of remember what this happened for me, but it was because you said a specific prayer.
Yeah.
Right? And we remember this teaching, or some may be familiar with it, and others it might be completely foreign, but this, what we called the Roman road. And
That's
so
right.
You had to go through these, it was like 4 steps of understanding about how depraved you are, how you had sinned, and how you need God, and this is what you do to get God.
Or sometimes we would draw it as 2 mountains.
Okay.
And there was a cross that came up in between the mountains.
All right.
And you had to walk across.
And the cross was the bridge.
Was the chasm, or sin, the original sin, and on top of that, as you were talking about that and the word saved, even looking back, it was this idea that you were not only just following God, but you were signed, sealed, and delivered, totally God's.
Right.
Nothing else mattered. That you had received completely your new identity. You had received completely everything you needed.
Yeah, and so that whole idea would be like that once saved, always saved type thing.
Right.
What I would like to talk about today is what seems to be behind the question. And what I think is behind the question is this: how do I know if I'm right with God?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the real question that people are looking for. I don't think the Bible really is interested in how do you get saved the way we talk about it. I think the Bible is actually trying to answer the question, how do I know if I'm right with God, and how do I know if God's okay with me?
And I think a secondary question to that then is, where does faith play into it, and what is faith?
Okay.
Exactly.
In what way, real quick?
I think we often interchangeably use the word salvation and faith when we're talking about salvation, or if that person's saved.
Oh, like came to faith?
Yes.
Okay.
And as if we're fully accomplished. And we'll talk about that. I have a place I want to bring that up later. But
it's fine.
I think it's not only so much, right, how do we be right with God, but what does it mean to maintain relation? And faith is a relationship. What does it mean to maintain relationship with God?
Okay. So what I figured we'd start with was just where does this idea come from of getting saved? And I find it, for one, when you look up kind of keyword phrases, Revelation 3:20, it says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in to him and eat with him and he with me." And so then from that's where you have that invite Jesus into your heart thing,
right,
and get saved. The problem that I find with this is that, to me, as a concept, that's not sitting here in this text.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is what we would call proof texting, that you're taking a passage and injecting an idea into it to make it say something of a what we call a doctrine, right, that we want it to say, because we've developed these theories for what's going on and how it happens, as opposed to let the Bible speak for itself.
And usually when we're talking about salvation or being saved, we're talking about being saved from death or from separation from God. This passage isn't speaking necessarily to an eternal state. It is speaking to a here and now state. And I think it has eternal consequences. But proof texting makes this all about, I get to go to heaven when I die.
When I die, exactly.
But
because I invited Jesus into my heart, because, if anyone would invite me in and so forth.
To me, this passage is saying you get to experience that life now if you invite me in.
Sure. Yes. That's a great point. Another one is Acts 2:37-41, where Peter is finishing this grand first sermon of his after Pentecost, when they're like, what the heck is going on here?
Right.
And he's explaining what's going on, but then also describing, Christ, the Messiah, is the one. And he's the one that died, he rose, and he was the one. So there's this question that they ask, and the audience asks, it says, "Brothers, what must we do?" But tell me if you've had this. I've heard this spoken.
I know where you're going with this. Yeah.
Brothers, what must we do to be saved? Yeah.
Right.
And then you look at the passage, it's not there.
Right.
And it's not
more of a question of how do I respond now?
Yeah. What should we do in light of what you're telling us?
Yeah.
Right. Because they had a conviction. They're drawn to the message, which was a good thing, right?
Yep.
They weren't condemned in the message. They had a conviction. And well, then what do we do? And when I hear this, it doesn't seem to have a tone of mocking. Well, what do you think we should do then?
Right. Yeah.
It's, oh my goodness, I need that. I want that. What do I do to get it?
I'm already living at the fullest capacity of what I know to do. So what's the next? Yeah.
Right. And so the idea of saved, it's not there in that passage. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. But the idea of saved because I'm baptized as a baby, saved because I said a special prayer. If it was about a prayer, all the other heroes of the faith that are in what we call the great faith chapter, that's where part of where that, you're referring to that word.
Yeah.
All those
Which
people,
is Hebrews 11.
Hebrews 11, all those people, if it was about a prayer, think about that for a second. They're still lost, because show me where Abraham said a prayer. Show me where Peter said a prayer.
I was going to turn it. I was like, don't even go there. Just say, where did any of the apostles say, "Dear Lord, I believe in you. Come into my heart." And
I'm sorry for my sins, and I really need you, and come into my heart.
And if that was central to what it means to be saved, it would be included very well in the New Testament.
Absolutely.
I would say there's a few other passages too.
Yeah.
Romans 10:9. One of my favorite to quote. I say this at the end of so many sermons where I work. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, Paul says to the church in Rome, you will be saved.
There you go.
I love this verse because what it's saying is there's an announcing part, and I agree with that. if you confess with your mouth, right? We have to speak it publicly,
Mm-hmm.
speak it, we announce it. There's an embodying part. We believe it in our heart, but there's also an aspect that we demonstrated, and we'll talk about that another time. But he says, then you will be saved. Now, I love this because it says you will be saved, not you are saved.
Yeah.
You will be saved. And Paul, in other places, such as when he's writing to the church in Philippi in 2:12 through 13, he says, continue to work out your salvation. Now, I've heard people try to explain that one thing as an outlier away, and everything else is this sign, seal, delivered idea of salvation. But he says, continue to work out your salvation. Here he says, and you will be saved eventually. And the word for saved there is sozo. It's more of a rescue than this, what we relate to a born-again experience. But just to flip one more on that, Paul, just a chapter later, so Romans 10:9, right? If you confess with your mouth, you'll be saved. Romans 10:17, he says, but faith comes from hearing. It's faith that saves us, if you will.
Yeah.
And so he says, though, faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Jesus, hearing the word of Christ, right? It's Jesus drawing us to it, and we're responding. What shall we do? Well, we respond to that. We announce it, we demonstrate it. But this idea of the born-again salvation experience is not a New Testament idea based on any of these passages.
Yeah, that's a great passage, because otherwise the only closest thing that when you have that, what do I have to do to be saved, is Acts 16:30.
Yeah.
The jailer, the Philippians jailer, says, sirs, what must I do to be saved? So that's the only place you actually find that as a sentence together. Paul, I love your reference, because Paul basically identifies it's not about a prayer.
It's not about a prayer.
It's not about the actions you've done, whether you're the good person or not. It really comes down to this thing of what you're describing. Do you believe and confess Jesus is Lord? That's what that's really saying.
Right.
Right? In its own way, but how we would probably simplify it into our language would just be, Jesus is Lord.
So here's the rebuttal, though, because I can hear somebody asking, it's already in their head, but what about Nicodemus?
What about him?
Well, Nicodemus is always used as a proof texting of what salvation is, the born-again salvation experience.
Do I have to go into my mother's womb?
Right.
Again?
Jesus says to him, you must be born again. And right, Nicodemus, probably somewhat tongue-in-cheek, says, right, do I need to go back inside my mom? That's weird. And Jesus says, no. Basically, for me, that passage is not what we've made it about a born-again experience of say this prayer, but rather he's saying, unlearn everything you've thought you've known about me and relearn who I am. And start over, be a kid again, which we know salvation, or the act of being saved, also carries with it that we need to become like children in the New Testament. I think that's what more so what's happening there. The idea, though, that gets tied into salvation is a stretch. That's not what that passage is about.
Right, because really we're talking about how are you?
Yeah.
Right? And what is the point of crossing over from, whether you want to say it's one kingdom to God's kingdom, or whether you want to say outside of God's family, how do you cross over into God's family?
That's right.
Right? Whatever that thing is, what is that called? Let's just call it a mechanism. What is that mechanism that gets you from the one point to the other point?
And that's where I think faith comes in. The word pistis in the New Testament, that how do I have a confidence or a fidelity or a trust in who God is? And so for me, that mechanism of how do I know if I'm right with God is faith is the answer.
Faith is driving.
Yeah, the faith is, it's not a prayer.
Yeah.
Right. I know when we get to heaven, there will be people there that said that prayer. And I suspect there will be a lot of people there that never said a prayer that resembles anything like what we call, are you saved? I also think there will be people that are not there that may have said that prayer and lived totally contrary. Like they won't be there. Yeah.
Right. There's that. Was it consistent and so forth?
But going back, so how do we know we're going to be right with God?
In the New Testament,
yes,
I think the answer is right there. I think it's fairly plain. I don't want to say simple. I think it's profound. It's right there in black and white. Confess Jesus is Lord. That confession, meaning I take that into myself,
yep.
and you don't have to go around saying it all the time, but it's a belief that causes the ongoing change and continual readjustment of my life in the places that I continue to find do not align with his lordship.
Yeah. And that's, some people are going to say, well, that's Paul and he's talking about it. But Jesus says something very similar.
Okay.
John 14, 15 through 24. If you love me, or if you want to be love is a relationship. If you want to be in relationship with me, what's he say? Keep my commandments, right? Mm-hmm. He says, who keeps my commandments is the one who loves me. And if anyone loves me, he will keep my word. He'll be obedient to what I'm doing, and I will come and make home with him, right? I will have faith with him. I will have this saving act with him. And so I think even in Jesus' teaching, we see it's not about a prayer, it's about a commitment that we make.
Mm. And a lot of times we've tried to use, I'm thinking about this now, that tactics basically of fear. We do that with the, hey, accept Jesus into your heart, that all that passage we've talked about, so that you'll go to heaven when you die.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to go to hell, do you?
Yeah.
And again, I'm not here to say that hell is not a reality, but there are vast discussions and debates on that.
That's an episode for another time.
It's another episode, right?
There is a place without God's presence for sure.
Yeah. But the point being, I don't think scaring people into it and trying to strong arm them into a belief system is of any help, really.
Right. And just saying that prayer doesn't have a transformative aspect. Well, people are going to say, well, then God will put his spirit. No, the spirit comes in there from your commitment to, not just saying a prayer. The commitment through a prayer is important. Lord, I want to follow you. Show me where I'm messed up. But it's about our commitment, our response to it, serving him as Lord that matters, not so much an act we do. You know, I can go to the president and say, I want to be a really good citizen, mm-hmm. which means squat if I go and break the law right after that.
Yeah.
The only thing that matters if I'm a good citizen is how I live in response to my citizenship. And I think that's the same with Jesus.
Right. That whole, is there a change that demonstrates the inner, like that belief that it's inside, it's your conviction and your surrender to live by it versus, well, I said the prayer or I said I believed it, now I can keep doing what I want, right? I think Peter also does give an answer that is toward your, like,
yeah.
He makes it do an outward expression that demonstrates this. I'm moving from one kingdom to another.
And James, the brother of Jesus, would do the same thing. Faith without works is dead.
Faith without works is dead. In the response to, brothers, what should we do? Peter tells them, be baptized for the forgiveness of your sin.
Right.
And so we've kind of taken that one and made it the
sinner's prayer. Yeah.
Right. We inject that into the sinner's prayer type stuff. Oh, I've sinned and I need forgiveness. Yeah, absolutely we do. But he doesn't say a prayer.
There's something more revolutionary to what Peter's saying than just a prayer of naming every sin you can think of.
But the baptism, that's probably culturally that's a mikvah, mm-hmm. right, and so forth. And John was baptizing people and all that. So there's a number of different things that come in culturally there. But it was the act that represented, just like circumcision was the act that represented their fidelity to God.
Public declaration of an inner reality.
Yeah. And so that's the demonstration of how we're saved. Paul gives from your passage in Romans, really, how do you get saved?
Right. What kind of commitment are you making?
The faith, how do you vocalize that, right? How do you verbalize it? And what struck me with this podcast was the story of Naaman the leper. Back in 2 Kings 5:1-19, there's this guy. He's I think an Assyrian, perhaps. Sorry about that one, but not Israelite. Has an Israelite slave girl who's something like 7-9 years old, something really young. Yeah. Naaman has leprosy. Naaman is he's the commander of the king's army, and he's got leprosy. And his slave girl says, if you go see Samuel in Israel, he'll heal you. It's the man of God. He'll heal you. So he goes, brings all this loot with him to try to purchase and bribe the thing, which is what you would do to get the gods to do. It was basically a sacrifice of his own kind. And so after he's talked out of his reluctance to go dip in the Jordan River because he thinks it's just messy and dirty, he obeys it and he gets healed of the leprosy. Yeah. Right? One of those things we talked in the last podcast about with a miracle and stuff. So, but what he says is, and this is their cultural expression, when he's getting ready to leave, he wants to take some dirt with him.
Because God lives there.
Because God lives there.
Yeah.
And what he's saying, this is where the "is God okay with me" also comes into this. And am I okay with God? Does he know my heart? He says, look, I'm a servant to the king, and I have to help the king when he goes and worships his God. So can I take some of Yahweh's ground with me? Because if I take his ground, I'm going to I'll put that on the ground, and it will be Yahweh's territory
where I'm
at. Because and what he's telling him is, that's how I can demonstrate I'm his. And he asks Samuel, he says, I got to do this, but can I do it? Can I take dirt? Can I take his ground? And he goes, yeah, God's okay with you. Meaning shalom, go in peace. Meaning, yes, I get what you're confessing. It's the right confession. Yes, Yahweh is Lord.
Have shalom as you go.
Go ahead. Right? And Jesus references him in the Gospels. They get upset with him. The Jews get upset with him, but Jesus references him as a person of faith.
Yeah.
Right? Along with the widow and so forth. But he references a Gentile of the Old Testament as a person of faith. He never said a prayer, but he was confessing, I'll throw Jesus in there, but he was confessing a Jesus is Lord of his time.
Yeah, I like that. For me, I think when I think of this question, how do I know if I'm right with God, or if it's not about this prayer, what's it about? The thing that comes to me is it's simply just saying, you have my yes. If you would look at any of the apostles, any of the New Testament, Paul on the road, he has this encounter and God tells him what to do. And he says, yes, okay, I'm going to do it. That's his salvic moment, right? Mm-hmm. That's his moment in where he begins to transition out of everything that's defined him up to this point. For Naaman, it's encountering Samuel, right? And God through the healing act of Samuel. And when he goes, he takes a symbolic thing with him, but he's going now saying yes to Yahweh. And the prayer doesn't need to be formulaic. It's, God, you have my yes. And so we know we're right with God if we're continually saying yes. Now, there are parts of our life that we struggle with at times, sins, struggles that we say no to God in one area of our life. But overall, if we're still saying yes to God, I want to be like you, we're allowing that yes to transform who we are, we're right with God. As long as we're still making ourselves soft to the ways of God. The time and time again, New and Old Testament, what do we hear? Do not let your hearts be hardened.
Yeah.
Closed off, right? don't say no to what God is up to.
Right. Yeah. And it's so, in one sense, is it like saying having a soft enough heart to let God into your life?
And then being willing to respond to it.
Fair enough. Absolutely. Because there's got to be evidence that backs up the expression, the conviction, the confession.
Hence the parable of the sower, right? Have the right kind of soil, but then in your life, there should be something sprouting.
It should bear fruit if it's of the Holy Spirit.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So what do you say with this whole thing? How do we say it? How do we know we're good with God? What do you say to the person that they're like, I'm not interested in going to church, but I'm looking for meaning in my life, and is God the answer to that?
Say that question in a different way for me.
What do you say to the person that's seeking?
Yeah.
But scared?
That's a good question. And this is what I would say. You know, I have a daughter that loves roller coasters now. But she didn't like roller coasters, she said before. But she actually didn't know if she liked roller coasters or not because she never said yes to going on a roller coaster. The moment she said yes to going on a simple upside down roller coaster, she loved it. And her and my wife go on it all the time now, right? It's changed who she is. It's a passion she has now. And this is my thinking. Go ahead.
It was different than she thought it would be.
Exactly. And so some of my favorite spiritual seekers that have come to know the Lord started with a prayer. God, if you're real, if you're really real, say yes. Say something to me or reveal something to me. And sometimes that was miraculous and sometimes it was a softening of the heart. And this is all that is God, I'm choosing in this moment to trust that you're there and I'm going to say yes to you. And I'm going to pay attention to where you're leading me from here on. So worst thing you can do is try it on, right? Say yes to it and look for it. And as you then experience God, allow it to transform your life. Allow it to have weight. If he really is who he says he is and you encounter him to be what he says he does, then be obedient to him. You know, I forget what the full Wimber quote is, but he said something along the lines that our true faith comes not just out of our worship, but our obedience, or like it's how we obediently follow after. Mm-hmm. And so to the seeker, I say, just try saying yes, try it on and test the fruit.
Yeah. Yeah.
What about you? What would you say? Same question. I'm thinking of Naaman, and when his servants basically challenged him on it, because he was like, this water is disgusting. We got better stuff back at home. They were like, how desperate are you? And then he was like, yeah, okay. Because he was desperate. He was desperate enough to try, right? And I'm thinking about that whole thing of being desperate to a seeker, to anyone in that position. There are very few times that you can say global statements. You know, we're taught, don't ever say either or, right?
Never, always. There is never a time that God leaves someone unanswered in their desperate call.
Yep.
So to say it a positive way, God always responds to the call in desperation.
Because he's already knocking on our hearts.
Yes.
We got to make sure we put that theologically correct, that he's pursuing us first.
Fine. So I guess that's what I would say is like, God will never despise your desperation.
That's right.
Ever. If we're willing to try.
That's good. And I think that question, how do I know if I'm right with God, often comes out of a fear, which this prayer provides an answer for. This, what we have identified as the salvation prayer, like, dear Jesus, please come here. And that is, the fear is that I'm missing out, or that I'm not truly part of it, or that I'm not good enough. And those things don't get answered any better by formulaic prayer, because we treat that prayer as if that moment is the saving moment. There's nothing else to do. It's the born again moment where we're completely different. Saying yes to Jesus is a journey. I'm still learning to say yes to Jesus in areas of my life. So seekers also don't give up saying yes to Jesus. Like, there's still ways that I'm trusting him and stepping out in faith more and more. And I would say that as part of that, the more I'm saying yes to him, there's more areas of my life that are becoming transformed. But even more, I'm still working out my salvation. And I'll truly be saved when this life is over and God restores completely creation. I will be among those that share in his presence. We know we're right with God because when we say yes to him, that eternal life comes into the present as well. In this present moment, we begin to experience God's spirit or presence. And so there's a taste of that to come. And I would also say that it needs continual obedience. A prayer makes it so simple and easy that we've done this one thing and it doesn't matter what else we do after this point. But there's nowhere in the scriptures do we see that prayer. No, there's nowhere in the scriptures that we see that a life of obedience isn't actually the defining point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a good place to land. We hope we're glad you stayed with us. We're glad you joined us today, and we hope that you will just call out to God. And as you do, come face to face with God by coming face to face with his word.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Discovering God podcast. We hope it encouraged you or empowered you in some way. If it has, we invite you to like, share, or comment on this. Even share it to your feed so it can encourage and empower others. Additionally, you can find us on almost every social media account, from TikTok to YouTube to Instagram to Facebook. Just look for Discovering God and find our compass logo.